Happy Wednesday. Yes, we're very excited to have you with us live talking about the Wellness Manual. Um, we have been doing these monthly now for a little while, and it's really exciting that you're joining us. So,
I kind of feel like I'm on a on a talk show or something, right? I feel like I'm a guest or something with my mystery drink. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invite.
well, if you're a talk show guest, that means that I'm the host, and that makes me feel very special, and maybe future job in the world, executives.
Never
I
know.
will await your call. um, um, Before we dive in and hear all about our theme this month, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who
I
are
always
you?
I always hate those questions, to be honest. I always struggle with those, but I'm gonna do it for you.
It's a chill.
Yeah. My name is Alex Charles. I am 31 years young. I am a wellness coach, as Ariel has just said. I'm also a business and technology consultant. I love to travel. That's probably one of my top passions, alongside with wellness as well. And I really don't know what else to say when these questions get asked. So I'm just gonna leave it there, let that sit and marinate for a little bit.
Well, you mentioned travel. You've been to how many countries again? Some really astronomical number.
No, it wasn't. Well, astronomical is always relative, right? So I feel like right now the count is somewhere in the 30s, which to some people that's a lot, to some people it's not, right? But for me, it's a personal achievement there. So somewhere in the 30s. Haven't made it to the elusive seventh continent yet, but trying to make my way still across the other six. So it's been a mixture of, and part of the reason why my tag is called Mr. Worldview is because of that. Like I like to travel, but I also like to explore different perspectives and cultures and things like that. So that is kind of the combination as to why I got that Instagram handle, and that's where my website is mrworldview.com. But yeah, travel is definitely big on my passions, I would say.
Love it. 30 somethings, definitely a lot in my book. I
Very
think
cool.
I'm in the low 20s. So something to aspire to from my perspective. And
Well,
definitely once Corona is settled down,
yeah, that's been
goals
a
to
challenge.
pursue.
That's absolutely been a challenge. But yeah.
So today we're talking about the wellness manual. What does that actually mean? Oops, my phone's falling.
So I'm gonna flip it back on you for 2 seconds, right? So I'm gonna go in coach mode for 2 seconds. I kind of want to know from
Oh
your
boy.
perspective, right? What are your thoughts when you hear the word wellness, right? And don't just tell me what you think I want to hear as wellness coach. I want to hear like when you first hear the term wellness, what are your thoughts?
Oh, that's a good question. The things that pop into my head are sort of on two sides of a spectrum. One is health, fitness, taking care of yourself, um, sort of the self-care from an actual self-care perspective, and doing good things for yourself.
Yeah,
On the other end, wellness, I think, sometimes gets into crystals and essential oils and a little bit more of the woo-woo end of things. And sorry if that's pejorative to someone who strongly believes in that. I'm a little bit on the logical, analytical end of things. So when I hear wellness, both of those images come to mind. It's like, on the one hand, the sort of spiritual side of
yeah,
things, if I can call it
yeah.
that. And on the other hand, the actual practices of taking care of yourself.
Right. And I think I would agree with you on that, right? I think when it comes to the word wellness, I do feel like sometimes it can be a little bit overused and a little bit cliche. You hear it all the time, right? So when you think of wellness, sometimes you think of like just meditating or yoga on a mountain, or like 15 different types of green tea, or like pastel colored uh, words on Instagram and quotes and inspirational stuff. And those things, to your point, are actually elements of wellness and they're important. But I do feel like sometimes the average person, when they hear that term, it's really abstract, right? And it's hard to really bring it down a level to something that's like palatable and easy to define for the average person, right? So
Mm.
And that's why sometimes I struggle a little bit with calling myself a wellness coach, because those two terms are really abstract, right? It's very much not defined by the average person. So there are a lot of organizations out there that have taken the task of trying to find a definition, and they do a great job at it, right? So the World Health Organization, the National Wellness Institute, the Global Wellness Institute, all have definitions that I actually approve of. I think they're really great. But again, it doesn't get to the heart, I feel, of, what exactly is wellness. And for me personally, I would like to think of wellness as basically like, you know, wellness is your full evaluations, your report card of your health and your well-being, right? To have a
Mm.
wellness mindset is essentially to take active choices intentionally to just really get the full satisfaction and fulfillment in different areas of your life. So let's stay on the school analogy for a second, right? Let's say that you have a daughter, right? And your daughter goes to school and she basically has a curriculum of things that she wants to, or she has to basically do to progress to the next grade. Every day she comes home, you say, hello, daughter, how was school today? How are you doing there? And she looks you dead in the eye and she says, it's going well. It's going okay. I'm living the dream, mom. It's perfect. And you say, great, that's
I
amazing.
hope one day if I have a daughter, that's what she says.
Yeah, living the dream. Yeah, it's perfect. So yeah, the report card comes in, the parent teacher conference comes, and you go into class, meeting the teacher, and the teacher's like, your daughter is doing excellent in physical education, but I haven't seen her in science. She is suffering in math. She is underdeveloped in history. And so you're looking at the daughter and like you told me one thing in terms of how you're doing, and I'm hearing a different story. And imagine she looks at you and is just like, I had no idea that school was comprised of all these different elements. And you'd be like, you're crazy, right? But as crazy as that analogy is, I feel like that's how we approach life every day, right? If I ask you a question of how are you, most likely you're going to think of it from the perspective of my physical, how am I feeling physically? I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling hungry. I'm feeling sore. I'm feeling okay. And it kind of dismisses all of the different other elements, which I can get to in a second, but all the other different elements that comprise you as a person, right? So that to me is, the quote that I read somewhere. I think it was by an unknown person, so that's never fun. But basically, wellness comes from personal balance and not necessarily bodily perfection. And so it'll be helpful to look at wellness from that lens of, again, the report card of your health and well-being comprised of different areas. Oh, that's it for a second. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think it's it's really interesting because I think for many people, and I'll sort of leave this particular moment in history out because I think wellness is becoming more mainstream, but I think for a lot of people, the different areas of your life that you are graded on and that you include in your grade typically exclude or have excluded the actual well-being, mental health, physical health, or internal physical health, unless you're actually sick. Like, I don't think people necessarily took preventative care of their medical health or sought out mental or emotional support when they needed it. And I think that's started to shift. So it's interesting to sort of take that report card snapshot of a person's life and see how wellness can now fit into that more fully or more intentionally.
No, exactly right. I think it's multidimensional. It is something that is interconnected. So one area of wellness, for example, has profound impacts right on another area of wellness. If you suffer emotionally, that's obviously going to show up in different areas, physically or on your job or socially, right? So it is important to know that there is a range of different dimensions. Again, we get into that shortly, but there's a range of different dimensions that make up your entire wellness. It's not just how you're feeling physically, right? It's a whole range of things. So yeah, it's definitely, I would hope people look at it more from that perspective rather than like we just talked about it being very cliche or very, abstract. But you're really getting down to the concrete. All right, this is what wellness is. This is what it's comprised of. How do I increase that? my fulfillment and satisfaction.
So is that where the wellness manual comes
Well,
into play?
the wellness manual, yeah. So in 2012, I graduated from college, university, and I remember I'm a big Excel person, so I opened up Microsoft Excel and I wanted to like pay off my student loan debt. So had one tab open. That tab I labeled financials, and that was the beginning, I guess, unknowingly of my wellness journey, right? Because I wanted to pay off my loans. I wanted to understand how much money I should be saving and stuff like that. Put it in one tab. Over time, I noticed that that was working for me, where tracking this and basically making it concrete and having practical steps in this area, what I was able to achieve a certain goal. So opened up another tab shortly after, like with like my workout plan. So then that became the physical tab. And over time, that Excel kind of just grew into this monstrosity where it's like multiple tabs now of different dimensions of my wellness, right? So that might sound a little bit crazy to some people. So again, this thing works for me. It's not necessarily for everyone, but the same concept is there where I'm looking at this in a multidimensional way. And I'm essentially trying to see how do I maximize these different areas. So the different areas are, and there are various people who have different numbers. My number is 7. I've seen different areas of wellness as high as like 12, some as small as maybe 6. But it's spiritual, physical, emotional, intellectual, financial, occupational, and social, right? I feel like each of these different areas all comprise your wellness. And again, suffering in one area is not an isolated event. It is going to impact all of these different areas for you. So we can spend a couple of minutes talking about essentially what each of these areas are, and the strategies really around how do I improve this? How do I make my life what I want it to be through small incremental steps?
Yeah, I mean, it would be great to hear a little bit more about, what these areas are. How do you improve wellness, satisfaction, I mean, fulfillment in each of those areas? One thing that I do want to just emphasize is what you were saying about how if one of those areas is suffering, everything else will suffer also. I mean, we often talk about, and by we, Revel&Awe, and I think we as coaches, we often talk about how like you bring your whole self with you everywhere you go, and so you can't leave the part of you that's emotionally suffering at home when you go out with friends. And just because you're filling the social bucket, the social wellness bucket, that doesn't mean that you can really fully develop that and fill it without really acknowledging and taking care of the other parts of you that are suffering.
Yeah.
And that applies, all the other areas as well. Anyways, that's my 2 cents. Walk us through it a little bit more.
Sure. So no, what you said was spot on, right? It reminded me of an example that I recently had with a friend of mine. Shout outs to Demay. So in light of the decade that has been 2020, there's been so much things that have been going on, right? There's been COVID, there has been all of this racial unrest, there is a presidential election right now that is just taxing, right? So I think back in August or July, shortly after the George Floyd murder and some of the Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor events, I had reached out to my friend and asked, just text her like, "How you doing?" And she replied and she said she's fine, she's good, she's okay. And she asked me, "How am I doing?" And I said, "I'm fine, I'm good." We touched base that way. And then like 5 seconds later, it was just kind of like, all right, so how are you doing really, right? And what came from that was like an hour and a half of a conversation, right, where we just talked about like, all right, we got past the superficial stuff. This stuff is emotionally taxing, right? And as a result, the emotions that are getting involved and being taxed are now affecting how we show up physically and to work and all this other stuff, right? So again, I can't emphasize enough that these different areas obviously impact your whole being. So just going through them one by one, spirituality, right? I think when people think of spirituality, the first thing they think of is religion, right? And what that means. And part of that is true. My definition and the definition that's supported by the Wellness Institute is it's basically your connection to your purpose It is your connection to meaning in life. It is your relationship with something larger than yourself, right? And so religion can be an avenue that leads people to a greater light of spirituality, but spirituality is essentially just your relationship to your values, your beliefs, your philosophy in life. And so I would argue, and some people would say that obviously spiritual, if they're not religious, they don't need to necessarily be spiritual in that area that need to be developed. And I would disagree with that, right? Because I think inherently we are all spiritual beings searching for some meaning or purpose, right, in life. So to not pay attention to that area, really, in my opinion, is fundamental to all of the different areas, right? If you don't have that defined, if you don't know what you believe in, what you stand for, what your values are, it'll be hard to find satisfaction in your job, for example, right? It'll be hard to make connections with people that are not surface level. So spirituality is one area, one dimension. Physical, that's pretty obvious, right? Physical is, how much rest you're getting, what your nutrition plan is, if you're eating the right foods, if you are taking care of your body through exercise and activity, how you feel about how's your self-esteem, right? Like all of these different areas comprise the temple that you have inhabited, right? In this life. So that dimension is pretty self-explanatory because that's probably the most common understanding of what wellness is for people. The next one is emotional. Emotional is important as well. I think that gets downplayed, unfortunately, by one gender specifically. But I think, emotions are essentially how do you assess and how do you effectively manage your emotions that you encounter on a daily basis, right? And understanding what effect that's having on your actions, right? So emotions are emotions, it's data for your body. You have them, right? Like to make a judgment about whether one is good or bad to me is not necessarily the point. The action is certainly, what comes about from those emotions can be good or bad, but I do believe that time must be taken to really assess and get in touch with and connect with your emotions. So that's one area. Or another area. Intellectual is essentially the time that you're taking to really develop your creativity and just be a problem solver and have hobbies and to explore that area. I laugh because it's just like I have a guitar in the background that I don't know how to play it, but that would be one area of intellectual dimensions, right? It's exploring your hobbies, your passions, what you're good at, your talents.
For what it's worth,
Yeah.
I also have a guitar in my living room that I have not taken out of the case that I borrowed, and I have not yet learned how to play it, and that was one of my quarantine goals. So
exactly, we have no excuse. Right now, it's like I can say I have no time, but I literally have all the time. But anyway, that's intellectual. The next one is financial, and that financial again is pretty obvious in terms of what are you doing with the resource that you're given? The income that you're making, the debt that you might have. What's your strategy to limit that? The investments that you have. That area is one area of wellness where obviously is hugely important because that's one example that can affect all the other ones as well, right? If you don't have the money to buy food or go to a gym or something like that, then it's going to affect you. Occupational is very similar in my mind to the spiritual in some ways because occupational is essentially how you exercise your spirituality. It's how you find, your purpose is defined in your spirituality. Your occupation ideally could be something where you're exercising that, where you're actually finding purpose through your work. And so that area of wellness is important. And lastly, social, right? And that again, in my personal opinion, spiritual and social are probably arguably two most important ones. And social is basically your connection to people, your sense of belonging to others, not necessarily feeling loneliness, which I'm sure during COVID it has been affected for a lot of people. And so I just laid out a lot of different information, a lot of different definitions and stuff. So I'm going to let that sit there for a second. What are your thoughts on that breakdown?
I think it's so interesting because the way that you've framed it, first of all, feels very different from other ways that I've heard coaches and mental health professionals think about like the wheel of life. So I really appreciate sort of this this different take on it. And I think it makes so much sense because it's like there are all these overlaps. And I think that those overlaps demonstrate just how much impact each of these areas has on all the other areas, which I think is something that people oftentimes forget. Like if your financial wellness, if you don't feel stable, if you don't feel confident, if you don't feel like you have a plan to maximize your resources financially, it can take a toll on your mental health, on your physical health, on your emotional health, definitely on your social health. If you feel like not having enough financial resources is precluding you from participating more actively in social life, or if it makes you feel bad about yourself so you don't want to see people. I mean, the ramifications are really so far reaching,
yeah,
and real, and I think everybody can identify with, you know, how these things can so easily get out of balance.
yeah,
um,
yeah,
I really love what you said about occupational wellness and how the occupational area is like the practice of the spiritual. Because I have not heard that before, and I absolutely love that and want to quote you on that
I
because
just came up with that like 5 minutes
I
ago.
think
So
that, I mean, then you must be, you know, brilliant, which of course you are. But I think that it puts such a fine point on, you know, one thing that I notice a lot working with professionals, and especially people who are going through career transitions or um, like mid-career crises, whether that's, you know, 2 years out of college or 20 years out of college, uh, is feeling disconnected from the purpose, from the path, feeling like they're not in the right space. And so much of that is because they don't know, they're not connected to their values or their purpose. They don't know what their mission is and what they're working towards. And
right,
having that connection, I think, is so, oops, sorry, I just got a call. Having that connection to like your to the source, I think makes such a big difference in how satisfied you can be with your career. Or I'll also put it differently, because sometimes it's not the job itself that is the purpose. Sometimes the job allows you to fulfill your purpose in another way, just in terms of, you know, financial stability and means and the ability to
mm-hmm.
create a life framework that works for you. But if you're not connected to that purpose, you won't know that, and you won't know what purpose the job is serving. So I really love that, that connection there.
Well, I mean, it doesn't even
I
have to
also want
be,
to,
if I can just interject for 2 seconds, it doesn't even have to be
yeah, please.
necessarily your job, right? Like, so the spiritual area, for example, the spiritual dimension, that can be exercised in its own ways, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be connected to your job. So it'll be great if you can have in sync your job matched to your purpose. That would be amazing. I'm not. What I'm saying is, the point that I want to emphasize actually is that it is not necessarily required, right? You can
Mm.
be volunteering. So I can have a job, you know, making PowerPoint decks, Excel sheets, or whatever that have nothing to do with what I consider to be my purpose, and that's fine. But it's about then finding, you know, what other ways can I exercise that spirituality? So does it mean I volunteer a little bit more? Do I find balance in that way? So, you know, I do want to stress that you don't always have to find that, you know, perfect marriage between spirituality and occupation and get paid for what you love doing. You can find that in other areas as
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. So we have a few minutes left.
well.
What do
Quick.
you think? Yeah, I know time flies when you're having fascinating conversation that stimulate you intellectually and spiritually and all of the things.
Which is that.
Um, what do you think is one of the most important things that people who are watching right now can take away from this conversation?
Yeah. So what we talked about so far is just kind of a definition of all these different areas. Unfortunately, we didn't get to the nitty gritty of like, how do you really apply all of this, right? And I think what I always want to do and look at from a perspective of how can I make this practical? How can I make this tangible, right? So I defined all these different areas. I would say, again, get into the mindset of thinking of wellness in these different dimensions, right? And then doing a self-assessment in each of these areas and asking yourself, all right, you're familiar with scaling questions, Ariel. From 1 to 10, how satisfied and how fulfilled do I feel, for example, knowing my purpose and having a spiritual dimension that's, fulfilling? Or how satisfied do I feel in the physical area, right? Getting that number is very important because that is basically what you're going to measure your progress by. And obviously, as you know, as a coach, that's important because once you understand where you currently are in all of these different dimensions, you can start to visualize where you want to be in all of these different dimensions and understand where you want to be. And then how do you close the gap between the two? Right. And so I want people to get into the habit of thinking of wellness in these specific, defined ways, defining for themselves, just basically how they currently are showing up. And then asking yourself a simple question over the course of the next week or two: what do I have to do to increase this number of satisfaction by 1? Right? It doesn't have to be something that doesn't have to be perfection. Just what can I do to increase this by 1? And take the steps, actionable goals, in order to get you there, right? So when it comes to wellness, I would say I have 2 motivations when it comes to wellness. One of it is altruistic, and one of it is completely selfish. Which one would you like to hear first?
Good question. The selfish one.
I'm gonna go with the altruistic one. So the altruistic
Okay.
one basically is genuinely, when it comes to wellness, I genuinely do feel that I want people to be well. I want people to be happy. I want people to be fulfilled in their life in all of these different areas. Right? That's the altruistic. That's the one where I'm like, I want this for others. I want this for myself. The selfish motivation for why I stress wellness is because the older that I get, and the more I walk around in society, I am rubbing shoulders with potential psychopaths and narcissists and people who potentially are emotionally unstable. And it's funny in some ways, but it also is not. And so if I understand my wellness, if I prioritize that across these different areas, I will be able to identify more quickly people who are not compatible with my wellness. I'll be able to see, if you're in the dating world, you'll be able to see, all right, this is how I show up on these different scales. The person that I'm dating, if they are terrible in a particular dimension, say, for example, emotional, right? They're unable to process feelings or unable to articulate their feelings, manage it effectively. That is going to impact my wellness being attached to them. And so I feel like the more that people have an awareness of wellness, their own wellness, they'll be able to easily identify and discern the people who are not compatible for them. And so that's why I think from a selfish perspective, people should be looking at it from that standpoint. Not necessarily be completely about, just you, but also just look at it and prioritize. I mean, the biggest cliche that, the analogy that I hear the most, and I always said I would never use this cliche, but it's so appropriate. Like when you go on an airplane, remember back in the day when we used to go on airplanes and you sit down and then the stewardess and the flight attendant tells us that, you got to put your mask on before you help anyone else. I do feel like that is really encompassing wellness, right? You have to basically be well first before you can show up in all these different areas. And so that's the one thing I would say that people need to take away and really comprehend. Again, think of wellness tangibly. Think of it in these 7 different dimensions. Understand where you currently are and where you want to be, and then take active steps daily to close the gap between them and constantly evaluate that. And so, yeah, that's kind of the main spiel, I would say.
Well, I can tell you what's really resonating with the people who are watching us right now because they really identify with your selfish reasons for prioritizing the wellness manual and the dimensional thinking.
Yeah,
I too can identify with that. And I'm loving the comments that are coming in right now.
I see them, but
So,
yeah.
oh, well, I'm the lucky one because they're very supportive. So before I let you go, how can people reach you to learn more about your work and about the wellness
Yeah,
manual, dimensional thinking?
that is. That is a great question. So I have recently gotten my coaching certification, as you are aware, since we were in the same class together. But basically, I'm a wellness coach. And so MrWorldview.com is the source of all the information there. Some of the things that I talked about in terms of dimensional wellness, some of the programs that I have that I work with people on. Essentially, reach out on Instagram, on Facebook, on MrWorldview.com, and schedule a complimentary session and let's have a conversation and have a debrief about basically how you're showing up in all these different areas, and then we can take it from there.
I love it. I
How
love
was that?
it.
Was
Well,
that
you
good? Was
guys
that like a
heard
good
it
spiel?
here.
Was that a good spiel?
Yeah, that was a great spiel.
All right, cool.
I think you did wonderfully. And I mean, you guys heard it here first. Alex is offering some free coaching, and I would definitely take him up on it. I will likely also take him up on it.
Please.
So thanks everybody for joining. If you missed it live and you're watching the recording afterwards, please drop a comment in terms of other questions that you want answered, what you thought, where you want to improve your wellness. And we'll see you again next month. We have a really exciting guest in October, and we can't wait for you to join us then.
I'm not the guest for October.
Bye.
Is that what you're saying? I'm not the guest again for October.